Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good morning to you, and live outside Parliament, this is the briefing with Tom Harwood this morning. Of course, a very important morning, the state opening of Parliament. Today on the programme, we'll be talking to Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen. We'll be talking to the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Chris Snowdon, and we'll be talking to the director of the Oxford-Cambridge Leadership ARC Council. That's Bev Hindle. We'll be talking to all of them coming up and exploring what today means. What does this state opening mean for all of us? That's coming up after the headlines.
A very good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date today on GB News. The cost of living and plans to level up the nation will be among some of the issues addressed by the government as it sets out its priorities for the country in the Queen's speech today. They're also going to outline plans to crack down on disruptive guerrilla protests, like those used by campaign groups like Insulate Britain. Policing Minister Kit Mothouse told GB News the new public order bill will deter protesters putting other people in danger.
We believe that the right to protest is fundamental to our democracy. It's absolutely right that you should be able to go out in the street, make as much noise and shout and scream about the issue. But you must do it in a way that balances everybody else's right to go about their business and certainly doesn't put yourself or police officers in danger, as we have seen at fuel depots over the last few weeks.
The address will be slightly different today. The Queen pulled out of giving the speech following advice from her doctors. Buckingham Palace confirmed late last night that Prince Charles instead would stand in for Her Majesty. It will be the first time in nearly 60 years that the Queen will not be attending. We will, of course, bring you the address live here on GB News later this morning. In some international news now, the key Ukrainian port of Odessa has been bombarded overnight by Russian missile strikes. The country's armed forces say at least one person's been killed and 5 injured when 7 missiles hit the southern port city. That's destroyed 5 buildings, including a shopping centre. In his most recent address, Ukraine's president says it's the first time the port's been attacked since the Second World War. A long-awaited libel trial involving the wives of 2 former England football players gets underway today. It's dubbed Wagatha Christie. The high-profile battle is between Jamie Vardy's wife, Rebecca Vardy, and Wayne Rooney's wife, Colleen Rooney. Miss Rooney accused Miss Vardy of leaking false stories about her to the media. That's something Miss Vardy denies. And a painting described as a modern Mona Lisa has become the most expensive work sold at auction by a US artist. Andy Warhol's iconic image of Marilyn Monroe went under the hammer for a record £158 million. The piece was originally described by Warhol as his ultimate depiction of his ultimate muse. You're up to date now on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. Now let's head back to the briefing with Tom.
It's 9:34 and you're listening to, and indeed watching, The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, live here on College Green, outside Parliament, on what is a pretty momentous day. Of course, the legislative programme of the government will be unveiled, not by the Queen, but by Prince Charles. Well, let's get a little bit of the inside track of what's going on. I'm delighted to be joined now here, live on the Green, by Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen. Welcome to the programme, Andrew. First of all, what are we expecting to hear from the government today?
Well, we don't really know until the speech is given, but there's been a lot of speculation. We know there's going to be measures around levelling up and planning again, which is always a knotty issue with Conservative backbenchers. Lifetime learning is going to be certainly in there. Changes to the Human Rights Act to protect free speech, especially in universities and places like that, but also to make it easier to deport foreign criminals. And of course, there'll be a lot of clamour to ensure that that includes people who've entered the country illegally. There's going to be measures to do with the rental market, getting former retail outlets to let the rooms above shops, and also I think we'll see an end to the Section 21 evictions as well. But until we hear it, we don't really know, and it's going to be a different sort of Queen's speech because, as you've already said, it's not actually going to be delivered by the Queen for the first time since I've been an MP.
Well, that is certainly a big question, and I suppose the other thing about this is that this might be the last big opportunity of this government to set out its agenda, really, because next year, even if the election is 2 years away, everyone will be talking about the election and there'll be less legislative business to get done.
Well, I did actually look at some of the speculation around the bills that might or might not be coming forward, and if the ones I think are coming forward, it does look a little bit like an election manifesto to me, so anything could happen, Tom.
Well, Andrew, we're going to get back to you in just a second because we're having some little problems with your microphone, but let's move on for the moment and turn back to, I believe we may be able to speak to Christopher Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs, who, of course, will be talking about the economic implications of today, because it's a big day here in Westminster, and ultimately there are big questions that people at home will be facing. Particularly acutely, the cost of living will be a large one, and that's something that people have been bringing up again and again on the doorsteps. And of course we've seen those local election results over the last weekend, where many parties have some claims to have performed well, but in other ways each party has been beaten back as well. The Labour Party, of course, performing particularly well in London, but the Tories actually making gains up in the north, in the Midlands, and in some areas of the Red Wall. The Liberal Democrats and the Greens also picking up some seats in the south and the southeast as well. So really, when we're looking at the political context of everything today, the cost of living will be a very key issue. And I'm delighted now that Christopher Snowdon can join us on the programme. Chris, welcome to the programme. Today the government will really need to address that issue if it's going to be within any sort of chance of winning the next election.
Well, it would be nice, but I mean, how can it? I mean, the plane has already crashed into the side of the mountain as far as inflation goes. We're already up at 7 or 8%, and even the Bank of England now accepts it will be up into double digits by the end of the year. The government doesn't control the price of products, doesn't control the price of food. We are the victim of policy decisions made in the past and also global problems. You know, the Shanghai lockdown, for example, the sanctions that we put on Belarus and Russia. You know, all of these things are having an impact not just in the UK but worldwide. So if you've got inflation at 10%, you know, the government can't wave a magic wand and give everybody 10% more income. And even if it did, you'd enter a price wage spiral. So the damage has been done. There are things governments can do to help, but really they needed to do them a long time ago, and there isn't enough time to do them now.
And I suppose today this will be about the long-term effects. There won't be anything immediate that will help people. What are some of the longer-term issues that the government could deal with if we're going to have a more prosperous economy looking into the future?
Well, they need to focus very heavily on growth. And of course, MPs always say that they are committed to growth, but every one of their actions tends to belie that. So we need to see energy security, for example. We need to see lower taxes in the kind of medium term, and possibly to some extent in the short term. And we need to see deregulation. I was very pleased to see there's some talk of dropping GDPR and the accept cookies nonsense that we have to put up with online. That might seem a trivial issue, but actually a study came out this week showing that the economic effects of this pointless regulation of the internet are really actually quite significant. We've got the online safety bill coming up as well. Just stacks and stacks of regulations that we don't need and which hinder growth in all sorts of different ways. The government hasn't taken advantage of Brexit yet and the deregulation options that have come our way as a result of that. So there's lots of things that it can do. But as you say, these are more sort of medium to long term solutions. We do need to go for growth. If we'd have gone for growth more over the course of the last 20 years, everybody would have an extra have an extra £2,000 or £3,000 in their pocket, and the rising price of gas wouldn't be such an issue. We've failed to do that, and I hope and I think that the cost of living crisis is a bit of a wake-up call to the government to stop focusing on trivia and to focus on making people more prosperous.
And I suppose when we need to focus less on trivia, there is a lot of trivia in Westminster. To some extent, Westminster runs on trivia. Do you have any hope, Christopher Snowdon, that today people will focus on the substance of what is announced in that Queen's speech versus all of the paraphernalia that surrounds it?
Well, of course, I hope so. I'm sure you will, Tom, and elements of the media will. A lot of the media are still, of course, obsessed with Partygate and Beergate. As the year goes on and things get worse and worse, and we're really, unfortunately, at the start of this inflationary problem, really, in terms of how much people really feel, the cost of living going up. The energy price cap has only just been lifted. We are in for a tough time. There's no two ways about that, and there's no easy solution to it. And there's not actually that much the government can do. There are things the Bank of England could do, but they're controversial in terms of whether we should be raising interest rates or not. We do have exceptions to low interest rates, and raising interest rates are the normal way of dealing with inflation, but it causes pain. This is the thing about inflation. By the time it's happened, you've already made the mistakes, and you're already faced with a difficult year or two. The important thing is to not allow this to spiral. And I suspect that means that the Bank of England will take the view, and maybe rightly so, that if we keep our fingers crossed for global events improving, then a lot of these prices are going to come down on their own. But people are going to have to accept that their real wages are going to go down. In other words, in terms of inflation, I don't think many people will be expecting a 10% pay rise. And so, people are going to suffer. One thing the government could do, and perhaps it will even be in the Queen's speech, I doubt it, but it should be, is to uplift benefits by the rate of inflation. That's something that Margaret Thatcher introduced in the early 1980s. Benefits used to be tied to wages. She tied them to inflation, which I think is the right thing to do, because the government actually is counting on getting a lot more tax revenue over the next year or two than it has done in previous years, precisely because of inflation. Governments quite like inflation. That's the dirty secret. It helps them raise more money, for example, from VAT, from income tax, because you're keeping the income tax thresholds the same. People's wages are going up in nominal terms, but not in real terms, and the government's making a lot more tax revenue. Some of that tax revenue, I feel, could be used to uplift benefits in a Thatcherite way.
That's a really interesting perspective there, Chris. Thank you so much for talking us through those very real issues that, of course, are affecting people up and down the country. Thanks for your time this morning on The Briefing. Well, now I'm delighted to say that we can return to Andrew Bridgen live here on College Green outside Parliament, hopefully with a working microphone. Andrew, let's return to that conversation just briefly, if you will. Some big steps that the government needs to take to set itself up, really, for the next 2 years of government.
And to face the issues that the country's facing. So we're going to have measures following on from the energy strategy. I think you're going to see laws being passed to allow the proliferation of modular nuclear reactors, which we're going to need. If we're going to go net zero, I want us to be energy rich, not energy poor, and therefore we need nuclear power for that basal load. Lifetime learning, a loan account that you can access to learn throughout and get education qualifications throughout your lifestyle. It's going to be changing. Changes to the rental market, encouraging people to use the top floors above retail outlets, and also I think an end to Section 21 evictions, which are much loathed. There's going to be interesting things in this speech, and it's going to set out policies for the next session of Parliament, which, as you say, could lead up to the next general election.
And yes, and certainly, when we're talking about all of the politics and potentially the politics of the next election, for the last 5 months it seems like we've been talking a lot more about wine and cheese and now beer and curry. The leader of the Labour Party yesterday made the most extraordinary press conference, committing to resign if he receives a fixed penalty notice. Andrew Bridgen, what's your reaction to that?
Well, we'd already noticed. I mean, Sir Keir Starmer was in real danger of being eaten by a monster that he'd actually created himself by calling for Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak to resign just for being under investigation. Now we know they've had some fines for what's been going on at Number 10, and now Sir Keir Starmer finds himself under investigation for the events at Durham. I'm hearing from CCHQ that they think there might be more than just the events at Durham to look at, but it was pretty disingenuous of Keir Starmer to say that he'll resign if he gets a fine. He knows full well that Durham Police's policy on COVID breaches is not to fine on the first offence, and also that they don't fine retrospectively. So I think he's fairly confident he isn't going to get a fine. And for me, what we need to do is we need to have investigators who are investigating Partygate to go up there and oversee that investigation in Durham, so that we have consistency of application of the law.
I suppose that is a key point, although many people would argue that when the Metropolitan Police started their investigation at the end of January into those events on Whitehall and in Downing Street, they also had a policy not to retrospectively investigate and to have this sort of... they had an acronym that they used, that first they should talk and converse and then go through several stages before they get to any fining. That seemed to all collapse under political pressure against the Prime Minister in January. Might it be the case that Durham Police sort of do away with their policies in the way that the Metropolitan Police did?
Well, you can't start a football match when you already know what the score is going to be, can you? So, yes, of course they should. I'd like an assurance that they are going to look at it and look whether Sir Keir Starmer broke the rules. I did notice at that press conference last night, which I thought was cringeworthy, quite honestly, when Beth Rigby asked him, "Are you going to stand down if you've broken the rules?" he said, "I'm stand down if I get a fine." He's fairly confident he won't get a fine. That's not the policy of Durham Police.
Well, I suppose just finally in this conversation, Andrew Bridgen, you are someone who has called for the Prime Minister to go, and then you retracted your letter into the chairman of the 1922 committee. Is that letter still retracted?
That's a matter between myself and Sir Graham Brady, and he doesn't even tell Mrs Brady how many letters he's got. I think the Prime Minister is in his position, and it's a position he's put himself into, and Sir Keir Starmer is in a position he's put himself into. I think they should be all treated equally under the rules, and we should see what comes out of that.
Well, Andrew Bridgen, thank you so much for talking to us here on the Green on what is a very momentous day just in front of Parliament, and I'll let you get back in there for the state opening. So thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Well, turning now to some other issues, because of course levelling up is one of those huge policies that the government is really setting its sights on in terms of how it's going to deliver for people up and down the country. But what does levelling up mean? And does it mean projects in the Midlands and the North at the expense of areas that are quite productive right now. One of those productive areas that was an opportunity generation project that was started several governments ago, yet seems to maybe be hitting some buffers under this government, is something called the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, an innovative idea to link up two of the most innovative and growth-centred cities in the United Kingdom. Well, exactly where is that project now? I'm delighted that I can be joined now by Bev Hindle, who is the director of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc Leadership Group. Welcome to the programme, Bev. I suppose the first question is, how would you describe what the Oxford-Cambridge Arc is to those who haven't heard of it?
ARC is meant to represent a regional collaboration. So the area between Oxfordshire and Cambridgeshire, including Northamptonshire, the former Bedfordshire, Milton Keynes and Buckinghamshire, is that part of the country that has the greatest, if you like, collection and intensive location of assets dedicated to innovation and driving smart and intelligent growth, particularly around life sciences, energy, aviation, space, and mobility. So it's about how can those places, along with the private sector, work together to make better use of that growth for better outcomes for communities in the future.
Rowing back from some of its plans with regard to linking up, creating this opportunity area, this arc between Oxford and Cambridge. There's been a lot of local opposition to plans for new roads, potentially new railways, and perhaps most perniciously in the views of some local people, more houses.
Yeah, that's been a constant problem. And the mixed messages and the inability to be clear with the public that, look, this is an area of the country that is growing rapidly and it's continuing to grow and has grown for some time. There was never a 1 million homes target, but there are a lot of homes being planned and being built. And so we need to be able to make sure that we take advantage of that to create better circumstances and better outcomes for our communities. And the reality is, because of the changes of government, changes of prime minister, COVID, post-Brexit, many different issues that have come to be priorities for the government, they've lost attention and focus on the fact that whilst levelling up is a significant policy for the country, absolutely right, it shouldn't be levelling down. And the reality is you need this region to be successful to continue to support levelling up ambition. And by the way, many parts of this arc do not enjoy the prosperity of other parts of the arc. So there are areas that do need investment here and levelling up here. So in our view, the government needs to continue to commit to here. It doesn't mean it has to be solely public funded. There's a significant amount of private investment going into this area, but the government needs to continue to support it. As for growth, well, here's one of the problems. I think the general language that most people use is that growth can be bad, that more houses isn't good. But the reality is this area is growing, and if we do not invest in infrastructure, if we do not invest in the communities and the environment, I mean, one of our fundamental core beliefs as a group is, look, if we're doubling the economy in 30 years, we should be doubling the environmental improvements over that time as well. If we do not work in collaboration, if we do not have government support for that, then that's going to be even more difficult to manage. And our local authorities are struggling to be able to do that locally by themselves without government support. Now, it's a double-edged sword. What we don't want is a top-down solution that's given to us. I think that's part of the problem in the past. I think the public has reacted to that in a negative way. So can we find the sweet spot where there is local collaboration that's supported in a pan-regional partnership is the latest term the government uses, similar to Western Gateway, Midlands Engine, Thames Estuary. Will government support a collection of local leadership and leaders working together to be able to make the best of that planned growth, as opposed to constantly trying to react or catch up? And even worse still, that the infrastructure and the deficit of investment gets worse for this part of the country. That's not in the country's interest, and it certainly is not in the community's interest across the arc.
I suppose one of the issues of previous years when it comes to some small but potentially quite loud local groups being very, very vociferously against this project of development, potentially in a new context, in the context in which the country now finds itself with potentially a recession in the next year, sky-high inflation, the economy and the cost of living at the forefront of everyone's minds. Does that change the dial when it comes to talking about projects that could well produce economic growth for the country as a whole?
I think it probably creates a more attention and more focus on the need for strong economic growth, but I don't think that means growth at any cost. I think there is a lot of legitimacy to local concerns that in the past perhaps growth has not been invested in, so that communities have actually suffered. Growth has happened too fast without the investment catching up. In fact, many of our communities are still waiting for major pieces of infrastructure investment. Even East-West Rail, which was more or less as a given as a national piece of infrastructure, still remains part of it, of that East-West connectivity still remains unfunded. And so I think to a certain extent, yes, the current reality post-Brexit and post-COVID that the economy needs particular attention is right. What our proposition is, but it can be done well. Growth, economic growth can be clean and green, and we can support that innovation growth here, probably better than anywhere, possibly in the planet, but certainly in the country, where we should be able to take advantage of that innovation, that entrepreneurial spirit to do the right thing through growth, so that actually communities can benefit. So I think you're right. I think it absolutely will put a focus on the economy, but it should not be the economy at any cost. And I think people have come too far and our commitments are too serious around climate change and around social and prosperity and shared prosperity, that there's no reason why we can't deliver that in a more sustainable way. And that is our proposition. It should be sustainable. It should be high levels of growth that are sustainable and benefiting those communities, not at the cost of those communities.
Well, Bev Hindle, thank you so much for joining us here on the briefing this morning. Really interesting case study there in the Oxford-Cambridge arc. It will be fascinating to follow the progress in terms of what happens there into the future. Thanks for joining us. Well, now let's turn to the GB News royal reporter, Cameron Walker, who is live in Windsor, where the Queen is. And I am, of course, standing here in Westminster, where the Queen will not be. Cameron, what's the latest in the royal involvement in the state opening of Parliament?
Well, Tom, it's an event the Queen was keen to be at, but we now know that Prince Charles will be taking on this major constitutional role of reading the Queen's speech on her behalf for the first time. Now, the decision was taken yesterday by officials at Buckingham Palace in consultation with the Queen for something they called, because Her Majesty has episodic mobility problems. And I think to your eye, that perhaps means some days are better than others. And we believe this is a continuation of the mobility issues she has experienced since last autumn. She's missed the state opening of Parliament twice during her reign. That's in 1959 and 1963, when she was pregnant with Prince Andrew and Prince Edward. Back then, Tom, it was the Lord Chancellor who actually read the Queen's speech, but this time, as I've said, Prince Charles will be reading it instead. That's because Her Majesty authorised new letters patent, so Prince Charles and William, as Councillors of State, will be undertaking that constitutional role of opening a new parliamentary session on her behalf, and they'll be jointly doing so. This is possible due to a law passed in 1937 known as the Regency Act. But I have been told by an official in Buckingham Palace that Her Majesty does have a busy diary, so it's not perhaps anything to worry about. But of course, it's a look to the future, because Prince Charles is going to be reading the speech for the first time.
Certainly. Well, Cameron, thank you so much for that rundown. We'll, of course, be following it assiduously throughout the morning here on GB News, so no one at home go anywhere at all. This is where you need to stay to see all of that. Coming up, it's To The Point, which, of course, will be carrying more on the state opening of Parliament today. I've been Tom Harwood, and you've been watching The Briefing. Coming up, it's the weather.
Hello, very good morning to you. I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. A cloudy and damp start for some across England and Wales, but that cloud and rain will clear through the morning, replaced by sunny spells, but also some fairly lively showers in the north. At the moment, we've got a couple of areas of low pressure to the north and northwest of the UK. They've been sending weather fronts in from the northwest. It was a wet day yesterday for Scotland and Northern Ireland. That rain is now across central and southern parts of England, but really is a weakening feature. So the rain more or less petering out, very little as the front clears East Anglia and the southeast. Sunny spells then follow, and for the south and southeast, mostly it's just a fine afternoon with warm sunshine, 20-21 Celsius possible towards the southeast. But scattered showers for parts of Wales and northern England, and some very lively downpours for Scotland and Northern Ireland, where it will feel cooler, 15 to 17 Celsius here. And those showers turning into longer spells of rain, I think, through the evening across western Scotland, parts of Northern Ireland as well. So an unsettled night to come for Scotland, for Northern England Northern Ireland. Drier and clearer for a time further south, but even in the south we'll see clouds thickening. 12 Celsius at dawn on Wednesday, but also some outbreaks of rain starting to emerge towards the southwest. And this area of rain is going to slowly spread across some southern parts of England, into the Midlands perhaps, as well as South Wales by the afternoon. A lot of uncertainty about the track of the rainfall, so some error bars concerning its position. Wouldn't take the graphics too literally at this point, but nevertheless some fairly useful rainfall potentially for southern parts of England and Wales. Scotland, Northern England, Northern Ireland keep the sunny spells and showers, and it's a similar picture here on Thursday and Friday, turning drier and brighter meanwhile further south, and a fine weekend for many.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio.